Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today so that we can continue this conversation that we started last week. We started it in Spanish and today in English so that we can reach more of our communities. I will begin by introducing our lovely group of professionals so that you learn more about them. My name is Melissa Shepard Williams, and I am a psychotherapist and professor. And now I want to introduce to you Anaida Colón Muñiz, also a professor who is dedicated to training teachers in bilingual education so that it moves forward that process of learning a second language. Now I want to introduce to you Ligia Grenold. She is a professor and also an entrepreneur. So we'll have the opportunity to hear about the educational context as well as the business context. On that note, I also introduce to you Maritza Collins, who is a professional in marketing, and she coordinates events nationally and internationally. Juanita Palacios Sims, also an entrepreneur and founder of the International Society of Black Latinos. So Juanita will share about the role that organizations play in serving the community. We have another educator, Blaine Watson, who is the principal at Manuel Dominguez High School. We have now clinicians to join me in this conversation wearing that hat. Eugenia Rodriguez, who is a faculty in the Cultural Family Psychology program at Pacific Coast College and head of the Latinx Family Studies program at Pacific Coast College. And Dr. Makisha Lawrence, who is in private practice and will also contribute to this process of exploring the global crisis in terms of the pandemic and social injustice. So let's start this conversation, shall we? Eugenia, please share with us what are the things that you are most concerned about as it relates to the way the pandemic and social injustice intersect?
Thank you, Melissa. I think one of the things that I'm most concerned about as a clinician is the emotional, psychological impact of everything that has been happening over the last few months and more specifically within the last few weeks. What we're seeing right now is a rising of social unrest that the truth of it is these concerns have been present for years, for generations. But because of what happened with COVID, where we were all sequestered in our homes and we were seeing social media and that was our only escape to the outside world, and then having everything happen beginning even before the tragedy with George Floyd, we're seeing a lot of stress, we're seeing a lot of anxiety, we're seeing a lot of distress, and very limited ways to express those emotions.
Absolutely, and there have been so many experiences of injustice happening daily, and that this situation places a magnifying lens on all of these injustices. And so we have an opportunity to explore the way it's impacting us psychologically. Not only the health, the physical health matters and the financial impact, but also the psychological impact. Makisha, would you like to add to this part of the conversation?
I think, as Eugenia said, it's a snowball effect, right? So it's generally not one thing. It's typically a combination of things. It's a statement that I use from you, Melissa, which is a combo effect. in terms of, some of the frustrations and feelings of isolation and stress regarding the pandemic, but then also those feelings of stress and isolation regarding feeling like there's been limited progress or a devolvement of progress in terms of what's happening for people socially. So I do feel like that's something that that I'm finding typically with clients as well.
Mm-hmm. A sense of devolvement. That's a powerful statement. And in times of chaos, we may feel as if all this unraveling represents moving backwards as opposed to forward. And yet, one thing that we're learning, and we have all had conversations about privately, there's something about chaos that when we step back to look at it and catch a panoramic view of it, there's beauty, there's opportunities for forward movement, for shifts to happen. And part of the process involves increasing awareness on many platforms, definitely in the academic context. So I'm wondering, Blaine, what you would like to add about the role of the educator in this process of developing awareness.
So I want to thank you, first of all, and I feel honored to be the only male on this panel of wonderful female leadership. And to be invited to this conversation is a tremendous honor for me. So I heard this idea of injustice, and the first thing I thought about is injustice is institutional in our current situation and what we're living. And injustice is generational, not just institutional, but it's generational.
Mm-hmm.
And the two crises that we're living right now in our contemporary lived experience is COVID-19, right? And also the race crisis in our country. And I would say within COVID-19, from an educator lens, the struggles that we have is the lack of access to technology, lack of access to school, because school over the past 30, 40, maybe 50 years now has taken on a whole new responsibility. It's no longer just an educational center. It is a social center where people can access information and means basically to life. Also, we're dealing with this idea of fear. How do you mitigate feelings of fear in the community, whether it's related to immigration, whether it's related to COVID-19, right? There's a lot of fear and not being able to trust the system, and the system that's supposed to be established to protect the students and the parents, right, that we serve. And the second institutional injustice is around race, and relating to education, it's around identity. Right now, we're living not just a race crisis, but an identity crisis. A lot of not just youth, but also young adults, millennials, and also people who are a little bit older are struggling with their responsibility to their own culture. Also, we understand that the curriculum in schools has not. Today is Juneteenth. Let's honor that, right? Yes. Today is Juneteenth, and it's a celebration, commemoration of slavery ending in the United States of America. But I will say that this is the very first time that people are talking across the country about Juneteenth. And it's not something that's embedded in the curriculum in our schools, right? Because ethnic studies and just the history curriculum is not talking about Juneteenth as a celebratory date, right? And then also the idea around crisis around government as an education as a government institution is not protecting the rights of people through their race. It's not teaching people about the race and supporting people and edifying their race. So those are two major issues that we're facing right now. Again, to summarize, COVID-19 crisis, and then race crisis and our responsibility and struggles as educators.
Absolutely. Thank you for making sure that we highlight the fact that this conversation is taking place on Juneteenth.
Right.
This is a time in history when more of the country and the world is becoming better aware of the history that has intentionally been covered.
Right.
It is an example of systematic oppression. One of the words that you used that struck me was the word trust.
Right.
And part of the problem, it seems to me, is that by us marginalized people having trust broken, it really gets in the way of accessing the resources that could be helpful, because
Yes.
those resources many times are identified with institutions that for generations have oppressed us.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so for you to share, for example, the value of ethnic studies as a tool in healing is something I'm thankful for, and that we're going to continue reflecting on.
Thank you.
Anaida, please share with us your thoughts about the role of education, especially in light of the importance of ethnoeducation.
I think, thank you also, Melissa, for having us. The Gloria Ladson-Billings talks a lot about the fact that everybody talks about the academic achievement gap and the fact that our students are not meeting, you know, some of the standards that are out there. But she also highlights that it's so much more than that. It's about all of the other gaps that people don't talk about, like the health gap, the educational opportunity gap, the economic gap, the housing gap. There are so many gaps. And this situation we've been in the last few months has highlighted those big divides that are getting bigger and bigger every year, where fewer and fewer people are in charge of all the money that is made, for example, in this country, and less of the people from minoritized groups and even what was the middle class are having access to the goods and services and opportunities. So it becomes even more severe in our communities of color. And so I think right now it's put a lens on everything. And this situation, as you mentioned earlier, with regard to how children and teachers might be feeling, is exacerbated when, you know, we've had this technological divide and teachers are being asked to teach children in a way that they've not done before. Professors are being asked in many cases to, you know, to teach in ways they've never done before. And parents are being asked to play a role in teaching in ways that they've never done before. And then there might not even be the possibility of having the tools at home to do that kind of learning online. So we have a serious situation. I mean, I think when Blaine talks about a crisis, it is a crisis. We are in a crisis, and everybody's worried about getting out there and getting the economy going. But until we really look at what's happening and deal with some of these areas and do some major shifting and planning to improve and to redistribute the kind of wealth it's made and to provide better healthcare and better opportunities and better access to all of these areas, we're going to keep going down into some places that we've never been before, perhaps. And I think it's putting a lot of pressure on everyone. For teachers, I think it's being prepared mentally and also in terms of their own training on how to be, for example, to learn the history of the United States and be able to teach it wholly, not to have these selections of what is American history and then to leave out whole pieces for the sake of a narrative that isn't even real. It's not really our history. It's like a false history. So I think now everybody's sort of getting online with, wow, we got some major changes to do in policing. We got major changes to do in teaching. We have a lot of work to do in this country.
Absolutely. Thank you for listing the wide range of spaces where transformation needs to happen. And so this pandemic affecting marginalized people in a very specific way really makes it visible to not only us here in the US, but definitely worldwide. what are the systems that have been working mainly for a group and not another? When you mentioned the different ways in which teachers need to approach their work with children, and also work in the higher education context, you know, not everybody has access to the technology necessary to make these shifts. Ligia, you have talked extensively about your experiences in that arena. I'm curious about what you would like to add right now.
Well, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you, Elisa, for having me here too. Now, Anita mentioned something very important, and it's happening here, for example, in Latin America or in Panama, where I'm located. So for me, I will view this in the sense of this is everybody is being challenged. Okay, everybody's being challenged. Teachers are being challenged. Parents are being challenged. The government, you know, kids are working at home now. They're depending not only on their teachers but on their parents to take care of them, and it's not easy for parents to teach.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not with the material, with the school material. They teach in another way, but not with school materials. And parents are being challenged to do this job, and they are not finding it easy at all. Okay, as you said, internet is not accessible for everybody. You know, there are kids that they really don't have computers home. They don't have the access to internet home. Even teachers, you know, they're being challenged to teach in a different way. And so it's not easy. And the government is looking down now and saying, okay, well, you know what? Now we have to do something with internet, with the speed, you know, for everybody to have access, because everybody now is, you know, everybody's working at home. So it's not easy. And for everyone is a journey that we have to really walk together in order to make it better. You know, everybody has to like put their little, you know, grain of sand there to get the construction going.
Yeah.
That's the way that is seen here in not only in Panama but in Latin America.
Absolutely. And boy, is it difficult for a parent to wear this new hat, as you mentioned. What a difficult adjustment. And
yeah, parents are very frustrated.
yes, and the thing is, in addition to wearing that hat, they're also trying to adjust to telework. And that is if they still have their job. So there are many layers to the emotional experience we're all going through.
That is.
Speaking of the financial aspect of this, Maritza, from a perspective of life in the business world, what would you recommend that we keep in mind?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this afternoon. I think we all, not only the business people, have to keep in mind, like Ligia said, we're all being challenged. I think there's also a great opportunity for learning new things and realizing that you can do more than you thought with what you have. You know, this is definitely a state of change. In the business world, we've seen companies that had full buildings with people working, and now those people are working from home. Some companies didn't consider telework, working from home, an option, but now they were found that they had to do it, and it's working. But, you know, sometimes they had to update their equipment, but it's doable. And thank God people had that option because they could still work. Companies that are flexible and nimble and able to change their strategy and the way they do work are the ones that have been adjusting the best at this pandemic, like, you know, working from home. Or we also saw in the case of at the beginning of the pandemic that some of the companies, like a beauty company, instead of making makeup, they made gel, antiseptic gel, because it was needed. Community, collaboration. And we saw restaurants that at the beginning of the pandemic, when we couldn't get food because people were just buying it up, they were selling their provisions to help themselves and to help the community. You know, you couldn't find it in the grocery store, you could find it at this place. So I think We've all learned new things. We've learned that we could do different, and different doesn't mean bad, and that collaboration works and helps everybody in the long run.
So true. As I heard you say the word nimble, it made me think of how nimble we're invited to be in this situation in the midst of emotional turmoil. That's a difficult mix. That's a very difficult mix, because we can probably be more able to call something a creative challenge when we've paused long enough to catch a panoramic view and see options, and become interested in approaching something in a new way. But when we're in the throes of agitation, we're far from calling something a creative challenge or even notice opportunities for collaboration. I think that's an important piece, collaboration, and everyone has brought some angle of the importance of that ingredient. On that note, Juanita, as the leader of a nonprofit organization that serves the community, in what ways do you find that the International Society of Black Latinos has stepped up to be of help within the constraints of a quarantine?
Well, thank you for having me, Melissa, and hello, everyone. Well, we have stepped up in helping in the community, both in the African American community and the Latino community. Being Afro-Latino, we have been able to continue our work within the community in helping and trying to unite it. What we've done in the last 6 weeks or since this started is help with distributing food to those in need, because there's a lot of people, as Maritza was talking about, reinventing oneself. I'm in the travel business, and you best believe I'm trying to reinvent myself, but yeah, going into the community and helping those. And not only helping them in, the food and just a conversation, and even with the kids, when they bring their kids, you can see the fear in the kids' faces. And for me is having to explain and talk to the kids and, trying to make things a little more normal, which is hard during this time. But, again, that's our part within the community and helping and trying to unite people.
Yeah, thank you for all the work that you do. Maritza and I are part of this organization, and so we have been able to sit together and reflect about all that we have been able to contribute to in these 10 years of its existence, and now trying to reimagine ways of being of service in this new world, because as Eugenia very well said last week, normal left us in December.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, bye-bye. When you were discussing what it was like to come in contact with the community, you mentioned children. And we definitely need to reflect on how differently children are experiencing this situation that the world is going through. For us adults, it's rough.
Right.
On all kinds of levels. And children have a very specific experience of these challenges. Eugenia, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you. We're looking at children's reaction to any unrest because they look to adults as a barometer. They look to adults to say, should I be worried? Should I be happy? Am I okay? And at this point, the reality is the adults don't know the answer to this question. We are in just as much emotional turmoil as anyone else affected within the last recent months. But what we're seeing with children is that children don't have the capacity to verbalize in the languages that we understand, with the words that we would understand. And so they won't say to you, I'm feeling anxious, I'm upset, I'm scared. What you'll see is the beginnings of behavioral differences. They'll change their behavior, and you may see regression where a child might begin to wet their bed, or they need to be held, or they want you to feed them. You'll see anger, you'll see frustration, and these emotional outbursts that what is really them telling you is that they are not well, and they don't know when well will come back, because those that they look to be well aren't well themselves. And that's the challenge that we see. And we'll see that in their behavior. We'll see it in play. I always say that play is the language of children. So when you see them play and they're playing that they're going to the doctor, when you see play and they're playing and they're seeing someone get hurt, or the dolls are playing, cops and robbers, and the dolls are getting hit or being hurt. These are their ways of expressing this anxiety and this uncertainty in a language that they're able to express. And if adults themselves are in this emotional distress, we may miss those signs. We may just say, oh, they're playing, they're calm right now, they're quiet right now, everything's okay. But it's the opposite. And that's very telling, because they need just as much, if not more, support, because they don't have the contextual understanding of the years of living in this society with these difficulties.
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. It's so important. Makisha would like to share. I would like to take this moment to reflect on how it's important to remember that this pandemic has made difficult what was already difficult. What was problematic became more problematic. So people who were in desperate need of support for healing now, especially in marginalized communities, have little to no access to it. And so it is really painful to recognize that addiction has increased, domestic violence has increased, child abuse has increased, suicidality has increased. Mm-hmm. And so if the adults in the life of a child are not well, that really impairs the possibility that a child can move through this successfully. We are struggling with moving through it successfully. If we are not well, if we're not in contact with what's happening inside, we are not able to be emotionally fully present for the child. So I thank you, Eugenia, for sharing that. Makisha, please add to this. Jump in the water.
Yeah, just piggybacking on what Eugenia said, which is kind of the lens that I tend to see it through, especially with kids and their expression of distress, is sometimes their expression of distress can be viewed as very resilient, in that behavioral issues will get attention. Sometimes they don't have the language because they don't have the language, but also sometimes the behavioral issues that come about in the distressing circumstance guides the light of the parent's gaze, or of the teacher's gaze, or of the therapist's gaze, mm-hmm. in order to be able to address something. So that's the resilience of kiddos that we have to kind of honor, is that if, sometimes in the African-American community, we'll say, I can show you better than I can tell you. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, kids can show you better than they can tell you via language. And then I also think that the other part of the combo plate is that, there's this imbalance between expectations and reality. If you have a community that's already struggling with resources, or even with applying the tools that they have gained in whatever way or fashion to circumstances, sometimes they don't feel like they have the time to reflect. That the expectation is that they must speed up to gain, to be in step with those who they perceive to be advanced enough to, gain fluency in whatever circumstance. And I think that sometimes the piece that's difficult is talking with parents about allowing themselves the grace of understanding that they will not know how to do everything, that if they're operating in shoulds, then they're going to miss the growth process. The difficulty with that is that it requires you to slow down. And in our current society, slowing down is counterculture. And so that's something that I think has to be kind of emphasized, is that slowing down allows you to see the behavior that the child is telling you. Slowing down allows you to be able to metabolize what they're trying to communicate. Slowing down allows you to look at your own emotional process and see in what ways can I apply a healing balm to this so that I can be a guiding light to my child. But slowing down is also seen as weakness. Mm-hmm. And so that's sometimes the tug of war that tends to happen with ain't nobody got no handbook on how do you parent in a pandemic? Come on now.
Right.
Thank you for keeping it real.
I
was waiting for that to come out.
Right. Ain't nobody got no handbook on how do you parent in a pandemic during a cultural, socio-political uprising.
Exactly, because they all came together.
That's a hashtag.
Thank you.
They all came together. They all came together. I mean, the last pandemic was in 1918. What do we know about that? That's where my grandma was born. And we know about crisis, but not at this level. So that alone makes it so hard to be present for children, let alone for ourselves. And if we belong to a marginalized group, we don't know about slowing down. We're in survival mode. That's our way of moving in the world. Survival mode is not about, let me slow down, reflect, catch a panoramic view. No, we are going. And the pandemic has made us come to a screeching halt in many ways. And that's hard to sit with. To sit with?
And it's also hard, Melissa, to talk. I think I talked last week about how I struggle with talking to my sons, right, about two things, about the two crises, right, about the race crisis, but also about COVID-19. My 7-year-old, he just turned 7 on Tuesday, and we had a birthday party on Sunday, which wasn't really a party because we had, we can't really have a lot of people over. So that was a devastating blow. Right, to realize that it really hit home on Sunday when we realized we couldn't really celebrate like you've come to a birthday party here at the house. You and Maritza have been here before, and can't celebrate like the way we used to. His baseball season stopped and school has stopped, and right now he's at a critical age, transitioning from 1st to 2nd grade, and he has a lot of questions, and it's hard for me because like she said, I mean, our kids, how do you parent during a pandemic? Right. There's no instructions. This didn't, I don't know. And I'm struggling with how to deal with this in my own job and my own adulthood. How do you, on top of that, how do you talk to your son about race in America? Mm-hmm. As a young Black boy, right? How do you have that conversation? Right. And tell your son, honestly, as a Black man, I'm worried sometimes when I'm getting in the car, like we're praying in the morning. We've gotten this routine now. We're praying in the morning when I leave for work, and when I come home, because I don't know. I've gotten pulled over. I've had many issues with police, right? And it doesn't matter what degrees you have. It doesn't matter what experience you have, what level of professional you are. Right. You have this skin, you carry it, and you're a target. Exactly. And so, how do you have this conversation with your kid about what daddy's experiencing? How do you have this conversation with your kid about, yeah, you're not playing baseball this season, and you're not going to see your friends, and you're not going to have a birthday party, right? And that's a huge weight on us as parents. Right. And you feel somewhat irresponsible, you feel somewhat incompetent, and somewhat impotent as a parent because you don't know what you can do to support your babies. Yeah. Because you don't know what to do to support yourself.
Right?
Mm-hmm. And so it's a very difficult process. And if I'm having these struggles with as a parent who I think is pretty successful, and my wife is pretty successful with our parenting and our marriage with our kids, how are single parents dealing with this? How are immigrant families dealing with this? Where families, half their family is, on this side of the world.
Yes.
How are people dealing with it who are living in poverty, who are homeless, have all these other societal barriers against them? And there's so much that people are dealing with. And I just feel bad for us as a nation, as a world right now. And it's painful to even think about, right? And I'm grieving what life used to be. And I'm grieving what life will be, because there's a lot of uncertainty. But in the end, and toward the end of this conversation, I'm gonna look up a book that one of my friends recently published about living in the un. It's titled "Living in the Un," and I'm gonna actually invite her to one of these conversations because she's powerful. But she talks about living in the un. It's about people who live in the un are created differently. People who can persevere through the uncertain, the unsure, right, are created differently. We have to think about how we're creating ourselves differently in this time. So I'll leave you with that. That's what I was thinking about. That's the transition I want to leave us with, was we need to think about how we're leading and learning differently when things are uncertain.
Yeah.
Well, may I put
it is important. I'm sorry?
May I put my 2 cents here?
Absolutely. Before you do, I noticed Juanita had a comment, and I just wanted to put in a quick commercial in between, because this conversation is going to be shorter than the one we had last week. I just wanted to mention something that you reminded me of, Blaine, from last week. We had a more in-depth conversation about the issue of talking with our boys, our men, about this experience in the face of witnessing a lynching.
Oh yeah.
Because these things happen every single day.
Yeah.
But it being filmed made the world aware of it. It's inescapable. It must be addressed, and it's being addressed. And I was so thankful that last week in our conversation, we talked about the new ways in which it's being addressed. Juanita and then Ligia, jump in.
Well, I agree with Blaine, but I'd like to add a little more to that, if I may. I find hope in the future. As I had mentioned in our last conversation, and walking and the protests with the millenniums, things that were in the closet. Let's just talk about Juneteenth. Today is Juneteenth.
Exactly.
When did we ever celebrate it the way we're celebrating it today?
Never.
When did we learn about Wall Street, the Black Wall Street, and what took place during that time? For those who don't know, in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the early 1900s, about 300 plus African Americans were bombed because they were prospering and they were doing well and they were moving forward. I look at this as a time where it's cleansing. For example, with the COVID virus, I have never in my life seen so many people clean as much as we have been cleaning. So, and I was watching TV and they were cleaning the subway in New York and they're cleaning the metro here in LA. So a time of cleansing, not only for the outside world, but for us. I look at this as hope. We have an opportunity now to right what was wrong. For example, we have in our history books, now we can tell our story. We can add it to the books, where before we didn't have that hope.
Right.
Black Lives Matter is now around the world, even in our Latin countries, which they're a step behind us with racism, because we still are dealing with a lot of people that are in Latin American countries that still deal with racism worse than we're dealing with it now. So, not to take up too much time, but I'm just think for me, it's hope that the future is going to get better. We're reinventing ourselves. We're looking at things. So, for me, it's hope. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
It is.
Because
It is.
it's an opportunity. Please, Ligia.
You know, I wanted to mention yesterday, or day before yesterday, my son, he is turning 22 next month. Okay. So he is studying psychology, and he was studying with his group of, with his group. And they came up with this situation about the racism and everything. So he said, well, I have to deal with it a little, but my mom, she was very intelligent to sit with me and tell me a few things. So I have improved in reading and knowing about the story, the history. So these girls were in the room when I came in, because I came to give him coffee or something like that. And they said, Tia, Auntie, could you please talk to us about Black history? They go, well, I said, well, that's a long story, but I'll start by, and I started to explain to them. You have to see those faces. They had no idea of what even went on with us in history. So again, my wanting here, my need for people to read, for people to investigate is urgent. It is really urgent. They have no idea of all that we have gone through. They have no idea of our journey. So many years of suffering. People need to read. People need to investigate. People need to nourish themselves with the history. And then, only then, we might come to peace.
Yes, yes, Anaida. Thank you, Ligia.
So what Ligia talks about, I think this is how we give our children strength, by them knowing about their own histories. And I call them cultural anchors. If you have that, you're a stronger person. You can go anywhere and you can be strong. And so it sort of brings me to what Juanita was saying about hope. The fact that there's always a little silver lining, even in the worst situations. And Blaine was talking about all the uns, and Paulo Freire, Brazilian philosopher and educational philosopher, talked about untested feasibility. When we get into certain situations, we don't know how it's going to turn out. Right now, we've gone through several different issues of crises, and they're sort of unfolding, and people are dealing and coping and learning and trying to work things out. And there's always hope. There's always a tension, right? But there's hope that we can do better, be more human, be more conscientious. That critical consciousness, that awakening of reading something, oh my God, I did not know this. I didn't know this happened, in Tulsa. I didn't know that this was, an issue in the United States, because our teaching has been less than ideal, with the textbooks that, teachers have been given. But that critical reflection that we've had time for in this retreat to our homes allows us to think differently, to think bigger, to rethink education, to rethink policing, to rethink the way that the media and social media is putting out information, to even rethink parenting. I mean, and of course our ways of educating our youth and giving them the tools that they need to construct a better world, a world that we may not even get to see.
Right.
They are the hope. They are, and they are showing, as Juanita said, they are showing that consciousness of, this is not fair, that we have to do better, we have to be stronger, we have to unite. And even though, like I said, we always have these others that are tension, and there are always those other forces, I like to think that there are more of us that have that possibility that feasibility of doing better and moving forward in a positive way. Maybe things will get a little worse before we see that get better. But I always have that hope as well, like Juanita, that we're going to see some major change as a result of all of these things that have sort of converged at this time. And maybe because we've had the time to sit and reflect and to see the injustice so clearly and see this uprising, you know, it's going to help move us a little bit more forward than we have in the past. I always worry that, you know, we not take 2 steps forward and 4 back, you know, because you see that happening too. But I see now that there are things coming out now that ya no pueden cerrar los ojos. You can't close your eyes to what you've seen. Once your eyes are open, you can't close them again. And so that, I think, is hopeful, and I'm glad that, you know, we're bringing that forward, because we have to have a reason to keep going, especially those of us who are in the field of education. You know, we have to have that, or we would just be deflated. So I think, you know, there is always that untested feasibility that we can see a better future, a more humane world.
So true. So true. There are just multiple layers of this process of rethinking, to use your words. You know, the pandemic brought us to a grand pause and upheaval. And, you know, this is definitely a moment that's inviting us to shift. Leah, you were talking about how shocked Andy's classmates were to find out about historical trauma. And it is so important that we definitely jump in fully into this, because it is pain that's been moving from one generation to the next and continues to influence the way we interpret the world inside of us and around us. And so we need to continue becoming aware. And there's something that you remind me of, and it's a conversation that Makisha and I have had multiple times privately. The idea that while yes, we need to educate ourselves about the history, we also need to involve other disciplines in the process, like the help of mental health professionals, because the process of becoming aware of a very painful history, and painful is an understatement, and we're living the pain right now. In that process of learning it, there's pain, and we are a throbbing people, and we need mental health to intervene to support us in moving through and processing the pain that we're understanding better. So we need it to be interdisciplinary. So I'm so thankful that all of you are here representing several perspectives. Eugenia, I have a feeling you want to add a comment. Please do.
I will. It will be brief, but it will be in 2 parts, but it will be brief. The first one is just knowing, I just wanted to say thank you in just the ability to sit in this conversation. Because although I am a person of color, I don't know what it is to grow up Black in the United States. I don't know what it is to grow up in other Latin American countries. That's not my experience. I consider myself a queer person of color, and that brings its own experiences. But there are other experiences that I don't have that person to say this is what has been happening. And I think that brings me to another point of what we're seeing right now is because of COVID, because of the fact that we had a hard stop in every single thing that we've been doing in our lives, it forced us out of our comfort zone. We have a window of tolerance, and this window of tolerance lets us be okay with things. And those whose experiences hasn't been of oppression and of racism and of poverty and all of these other experiences that so many people in the United States have had, they were able to go on with their daily life doing everything else to not have to see it, to not have to hear about it, to not have to experience it. And so their window of tolerance was wide open because they don't have to do anything with that. But then what happens is this grinds us to a halt. And all of a sudden our window of tolerance shrinks because all of the things that we could busy ourselves with to not see what's really happening is no longer there. And now we have to face the fact that there are others that are suffering. There are others that are being killed. There are others that are, for example, the homelessness. All of a sudden, they're opening up these hotels and these buildings to house to help with the homelessness crisis, where what had happened before when we're looking at all of these industries. And it's this line between understanding, and then there are folks that are now almost pandering and saying, well, this is what's happening with me, and now I understand. I could never understand the experience of someone whose life I had not lived. But an understanding that because our window of tolerance has shrunk, that we now have an opportunity for others who haven't had these experiences to really see behind the veil and understand that this is not new, this is generational. And the change has to become where you are so uncomfortable that you cannot continue in the same way any longer. And that's where we're at. It is so uncomfortable for others to even just imagine it, that we have to have change.
Yes. Thank you for saying that, Eugenia, because it really it's shining a light on all these forms of discomfort. Like Blaine mentioned earlier, grief. We've gone through different versions of grief and still are. And community is so essential to learning new ways of being with discomfort, which is necessary for healing and birthing something new. So I'm praying that the reflection continues worldwide, that the momentum is not lost, as Anaida was sharing earlier and last week. What a rich conversation we've had in these 2 weeks. And one thing that I would like to invite Maritza to jump in with is something that we have had a chance to talk about as a group also, how we are learning to diversify the way we use our gifts in the interest of not just surviving, but moving into thriving.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. Well, I kind of mentioned it earlier, people, communities, as a community, we need to be able to do multiple things for ourselves and for others. Like if you say business as usual is no longer business as usual. Life as usual is no longer life as usual. So this is an opportunity for us to say, people say, when I grow up, I want to be, well, after the pandemic, I want to be fill in the blank. They say that the phoenix rises from the ashes. So this has been an incredible, difficult time in history for humanity, but there's great possibilities on the other side too. People that didn't think they could do something are doing it. People are following their passion because they're realizing, hey, we know life is not guaranteed. Tomorrow is not guaranteed, but I think now is even more obvious and more present in everybody's mind. And we're realizing life is short. Do what you love to do, help, love. And as a community, I think we can get through anything. And I think that's what this is showing us.
Amen. Makisha. Thanks, Maritza.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wanted to add to what Maritza said, which is a conversation that you and I had previously. And it's really just about what activism can look like, or what allyship can look like, what protests can look like. And so what Maritza was talking about is, being able to access some kind of internal fire to be able to feel like you can do something. And that is a form of protest. This this conversation that we're having, all of us are right now gardeners planting seeds. And we don't necessarily have the ability to see what's going to grow from the seeds that we're planting, but we're still tilling the soil. And so I think that as we continue to access that, as we continue to believe that these kinds of conversations, or conversations with friends, or with the gas station attendant, or whomever, all of that is part of advocacy and activism, because we don't know what kind of seeds are going to grow from that.
Yes, thank you so much for reminding us that right now we're planting. We're planting. And I'm reminded by our group of something wonderful that Eugenia mentioned last week. We are at a place of coming to the table, being at the table rather than being just on the menu. Amen to that. Shall we end on this note? Thank you so much for contributing to this conversation, to these reflections. We thank all that take the time to watch this. May it add to your reflections, and onward with healing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job, everybody.
Yes.